deeply. We're looking here at the oldest religious writings of ancient Egypt. These are the ancient Egyptian pyramid texts. And they are so called because they are written inside pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasty at Saqqara in Upper Egypt. And they are translated into English. Faulkner's edition of the ancient Egyptian pyramid texts is particularly highly recommended. They're the earliest of a body of literature of which the most familiar to us is the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. This entire body of ancient scriptures is all interconnected. They're conveying the same essential ideas, and those ideas concern the afterlife destiny of the soul. The ancient Egyptians believed that there was it's almost like a parallel dimension, another realm into which our consciousness enters after death as we leave our physical bodies behind. And they called that realm the Duat. We might translate that as the netherworld or the other world. And the god Osiris, my wife Santa took this photograph in the temple of Dendera in Upper Egypt. The god Osiris was seen as the lord of the afterlife kingdom, the lord of the Duat. And when the ancient Egyptians looked up at the sky at night and saw the constellation of Orion, the constellation of Orion was for them the celestial image of the god Osiris. And the constellation of Orion was conceived of as a kind of portal through which the soul would travel to reach the Milky Way, which the ancient Egyptians called the winding waterway, and then would make a journey along the winding waterway, and there be confronted by challenges and trials and ordeals that we have brought upon ourselves in the lives that we have lived. On the left, the pyramid of Unas in Saqqara, 5th dynasty, with the pyramid texts on the side. On the right, the great pyramid of Giza. This is, Santa shot this deliberately as a double exposure. The great pyramid of Giza, which is completely uninscribed. There are no religious writings inside it at all. But what's intriguing about the entire Giza complex, including the River Nile, is the way that it mirrors a particular region of the sky. And that region of the sky is exactly the region of the sky that the ancient Egyptians believed our souls travel through after death. This was the Duat, the constellation of Orion, the Milky Way, and the constellation of Leo, rising in alignment with the gaze of the Sphinx. Now, I'm not saying whoever made this majestic site actually put the Nile River there, but I am suggesting that the site was chosen for that reason. This sky-ground mirroring, as above, so below. And a final point on this, because of the wobble on the Earth's axis, the positions of the stars in the sky change down the ages, and what we're looking at is not the sky above Egypt in 2500 BC, when the pyramids are supposed to have been built, but the sky above Egypt roughly between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, between 10,800 BC and 9,600 BC. And this builds on the Orion correlation of my great friend and colleague, an absolute genius, Robert Bauval, the author of the Orion Mystery. So what we have at Giza, although there are no texts, what we have is an experiential three-dimensional model of the Duat, of the afterlife realm. How does the soul of the earthly deceased ascend to the Duat? Well, it's through that portal in Orion, and this is made very clear because there is a narrow shaft cut through the body of the Great Pyramid, and it targets exactly the lowest of the three stars of Orion's belt. And it's accepted by Egyptologists that this star shaft or soul shaft was the means of ascent, a symbolic means of ascent for the soul to leap up to the portal in the constellation of Orion and then to transit to the Milky Way and begin that hazardous and challenging afterlife journey. I did not expect when Santa and I came to Moundville in Alabama, in the Mississippi Valley, that I would encounter an almost identical religious system. Very little is left of the ancient North American monuments. More than 90% of the structures that were documented in the 19th century are now completely gone. And of the less than 10% that remain, the majority have been vandalized and destroyed. We are, however, looking at a bit of what's left of Moundville, and I was astonished to discover, as I went around the museum here and started talking to the experts, that here is a symbol. It shows a hand with an eye in it, except that's not an eye. And the hand was the way that the Native Americans saw the constellation of Orion. So I'll just read what the notice board actually says in Moundville Museum. As a group, the knotted serpents and the hand and eye are believed to be a representation of the night sky. The serpents are the ropes that join the earth and sky. In the palm of the hand is the portal or doorway through which the spirits of the dead can ascend the path of souls, or Milky Way, in their extended journey to the realm of the dead. The gateway or portal between the celestial realms and the earth disk was symbolized and artistically rendered as an open hand with an eye in its palm. We know this hand as part of the constellation of Orion. Once the portal was crossed, the souls of the dead began their journey by walking along a road or ribbon of light, the Milky Way. And indeed it was called the Path of Souls in Native American tradition. And thus over time Moundville became, in the minds of the people,
there may have been
not only the symbolic gateway to the realm of the dead.
I'm very particular with my wording, right? I'm saying maybe.
The materialized image of that sacred domain. And
I'm not saying I agree or not,
exactly
but
what the Giza
it's really interesting
are as well. They're a materialized image of the sacred domain through which the soul.
The Taurid meteor stream
diagrammatically
is
the ancient Native Americans saw Orion's
may have reached its peak, may have gone through the resident swarm
fingers and thumbs, and the portal
of the Taurid meteor
is
stream.
Actually the Orion Nebula,
12,000 years ago, leading to more comet impacts and like meteor impacts and stuff.
And a number of really excellent scholars have worked together to crack the code of the Mississippi.
Yeah, we talked about it before already.
They did not have a written language. They expressed everything in symbolism. But fortunately, there are a number of Native American tribes who have carried the ideas of Moundville down, and working with them and with the symbolism, the code has been cracked.
What's up?
And
What's
it
up,
is understood that the portal in the hand
Dragos
must be entered by
what's up?
a leap, that the soul of the deceased must leap up to that portal in the constellation of Orion, and thence begin its journey along the Milky Way.
Welcome.
George Langford, one of the leading scholars in the group who've been working on the Mississippian symbolic code, draws our attention to the fearsome image of a brain smasher, usually a woman, whose task is to destroy memory and humanity by removing or smashing the brain.
Okay, might as well start.
There are, in fact, repeated references to the brain smasher
I'll start in a
Native
moment.
American tradition. A menacing female figure, usually called the brain smasher or the brain taker, and her role
I'll count my sets in Japanese.
And permanent destruction of unworthy souls of the damned on the afterlife journey. So I was very intrigued by this scene in the ancient Egyptian book of what is in the Duat, one of those texts that I showed you, where we see, and I've expanded the key part of it here, we see a goddess standing with her hands stretched out towards a man who's kneeling before her. And what that man is doing, in fact, is he's smashing out his own brains with a hatchet. At least it looked like that to me. And looking at the scene, I didn't feel that the goddess was trying to stop him doing that. It felt more like she was exerting will or force to make him do that. But I needed to be sure. I needed to know if that was what it was all about at all. And since I don't read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, I went to the British Museum, and I got an expert at the British Museum to translate these hieroglyphs for me. I did not explain to her why I wanted them translated. I simply said I want a direct translation of those hieroglyphs. And in due course, she came back to me, Louise Ellis Barrett, and this is the translation she gives. She lives, referring to that goddess, she lives from the blood of the damned and from what these gods provide her, the bar soul who belongs to the damned, the demolishing one who cuts the damned to pieces. So it appears that in ancient Native America and in ancient Egypt we have a female figure who is literally a brain smasher or a brain taker. There is a star in the constellation of Cygnus called Deneb, which stands at a fork in the Milky Way. And in the ancient Native American tradition, this star was seen as a figure of a bird,
San,
often
Yan, Go,
manifested as some kind of
Oroko,
raptor.
Chichi,
And this
Hashi,
bird had the power
Ku. No, I
to
did only the Hashi.
the
I
further
only did
progress
Go.
of the soul on the
Shishi
journey
Hashi.
along the Milky Way.
Ku, Ju.
And the soul would have to entreat with that bird
That's what I remember.
request it to open the way. Oddly enough, in ancient Egypt, exactly the same role is played by a different kind of bird. These traditions adapt to local circumstances, and the bird in ancient Egypt is an ostrich, not a raptor, but the soul declares, "Hail to you, ostrich, which is on the bank of the winding waterway. Open my way that I may pass." There are monstrous winged serpents in the ancient Egyptian netherworld. And there are monstrous winged serpents in the ancient American netherworld as well. And here's another challenger on the path of souls in the ancient American netherworld. He's called the underwater panther. Clearly a feline figure of some sort. This is just a little clay figure of the underwater panther that has survived. I'm struck by its resemblance to the Great Sphinx of Egypt. I and my colleagues have always maintained that the Great Sphinx is more than 12,000 years old, and that originally the Great Sphinx had the head of a lion, that it was a fully leonine monument, but that the head was recarved during the period of dynastic Egypt into this human form, probably because the head was very damaged at that time. So I note the position of the forepaws on the underwater panther and on the Great Sphinx, and I note the way that the tail curls around the back, and I can't help feeling either this is some extraordinary coincidence or there is some deep-seated connection between these ideas. Amongst ancient Native Americans, there was a hero deity on the path of souls, and the role of that deity was to represent the triumph of life over death. And they called him the Birdman, and he's depicted here carved on a whelk shell, and he has the head and beak of a hawk and a human body. Oddly enough, exactly the same role was played in ancient Egypt by the god Horus, and the god Horus has the head and beak of a hawk and the body of a human being. Amongst the Skidi Pawnee, who were not a Mississippi Valley people, amongst the Skidi Pawnee, there was, until their culture was almost completely destroyed by the radical progress of Anglo-Saxon so-called civilization, there was amongst the Skidi Pawnee a ritual functionary who was called the chief of the astronomers. The Skidi Pawnee were particularly interested in the stars. And the chief of the astronomers is interestingly matched by a figure given exactly the same name.
Oh, one of my
in ancient
emotes is
Egypt,
Japanese.
the chief of the astronomers. He was the high priest of Heliopolis, which was the cult center of the Giza pyramid. And just as
Check this
the
out.
Skidi Pawnee, chief of the astronomers, wears a robe embossed with stars, so also does the ancient Egyptian chief of the astronomers. And furthermore, that robe embossed with stars, you can see from
the Japanese.
the leopard head here. It was in fact a leopard skin that was covered with stars, and in some cases in mortuary rituals the priests would wear a leopard skin. And that leopard skin, the spots on it, in themselves were thought to represent the stars. So it's intriguing that amongst the Skidi Pawnee, the same function was played by the skin of a wildcat. And its spots were thought to represent the stars, and a newborn child would be wrapped up in the skin of the wildcat to show that it was embraced by the stars. Again, I feel these connections become harder and harder to explain by coincidence. Let's jump over to the Amazon rainforest of South America, where the purpose of the portal for the soul is served by a very powerful visionary brew called ayahuasca. In our society, we refer to such substances as hallucinogens. I do not like the word hallucinogen because it carries a great deal of baggage. It implies that the visions received are trivial and not worthy. That was not the view in the ancient world. Visions received in altered states of consciousness, including dreams, were regarded as valid paths to true knowledge. It's very common in ayahuasca, in the visionary state, to see geometric patterns. I speak from experience because I've had more than 70 sessions with ayahuasca myself since 2003, when I first traveled to the Amazon to drink it. And here is the art of the Shipibo, people of the Peruvian Amazon, and you can see that this is their ayahuasca art. They depict it after coming out of the altered state of consciousness, and it shows these geometric patterns. And the Tucano of the Amazon and other Amazonian people.
This isn't my art. This is not my art.
Their whole culture revolves around ayahuasca. They regard it as so important that actually a newborn child is given a teaspoonful of ayahuasca on birth. And the reason they do this is that they believe that we are surrounded by an invisible realm, and that whether we like it or not, that invisible realm is dealing with us, and we need to be proactive in dealing with it. Our society, of course, denies any such possibility. Here we see a Tucano shaman, they call them the Payes, guiding his son through an ayahuasca experience, helping him navigate the infinite terrain of the other side. And after the shamans come out of the visionary state of consciousness, they will frequently depict their visions on any surface available. Here we see a shaman depicting his geometric visions on sand on the bank of the Amazon River. Everybody in the Tucano community may drink ayahuasca, but when important work is to be done, a group of shamans will gather together and they will drink enormous quantities of ayahuasca. And by the way, ayahuasca means the vine of the dead, or the vine of souls. They will drink enormous quantities of ayahuasca until they feel they are ascending to the Milky Way. And that isn't easily done. It's something that has to be learned. It's a skill. The apprentice may only get a foot or two off the ground, but eventually he will be able to soar up to the heavens in a single soaring flight and reach the zenith. I'm quoting here from Gerardo Reichel Dolmatov, his book The Shaman and the Jaguar. He's one of the great anthropological experts on the cultures of the Amazon. And here's another of his book, Beyond the Milky Way, and he reproduces in it a depiction of the entrance to the other world as depicted in Tucano ayahuasca art. The origin myth of the Tucano is really rather interesting. It sounds like some kind of deliberate and purposive mission to the Amazon in which people were deliberately settled in the Amazon. What the Tucano say is that their ancestors were brought to the Amazon by a group of supernatural beings. And those supernatural beings included the daughter of the sun and a figure who was called the helmsman, because the helmsman steered the serpent canoe in which those first settlers were brought. And these so-called supernaturals taught the first settlers where they would find places that they could build their villages, where there would be good hunting, where they could make fields and propitious sites for housing. And then the supernaturals left and the Tucano were left to themselves in the Amazon and instructed to forever remember those so-called supernaturals and their teachings. They sound a lot more to me like people than like supernaturals. Oddly enough, the same story is told at the Temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt, but from a slightly different perspective. In the Temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt, written between the inner and outer enclosure walls, we can find an astonishing body of texts called the Edfu building texts. And these Edfu building texts, deeply inscribed on these walls, this is what they look like. We're told in the inscriptions, which again have been translated, we're told in the inscriptions that they were based on much older source documents, that there had been documents written on animal skins which were falling apart, and in order to preserve them, the priests inscribed them deeply into the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu. And what those texts do is they speak of an island which was called the homeland of the primeval ones, and they tell us that it was destroyed in a great flood. And that flood was precipitated by some object coming down from the sky, a snake called the Great Leaping One, who assaults the homeland of the primeval ones and pierces it, and then it's swallowed up in a gigantic flood. But we're told that there were survivors, and that some of those survivors came to Egypt and built primeval mounds up and down the land, which were to be the site of all future temples and pyramids to be built in Egypt. And they also tell us that those survivors traveled all over the world. They didn't just confine their work to Egypt. They traveled everywhere, and there's a special word for their wanderings around the world, and their project was to reconstitute or resurrect their lost former world, or may I dare to say their lost civilization. This project wasn't only pursued in Egypt, but in many other lands, and I would suggest that one of those lands was the land that we now call South America, and specifically the Amazon. The Amazon basin is really huge. It covers more than 7 million square kilometers, of which still today, despite tragic clearances of the rainforest, 5.5 million square kilometers remain covered by dense rainforest. And almost no archaeology has been done in those rainforest-covered areas of the Amazon at all. I don't understand how archaeologists can claim to have a complete picture of the human past when we know that 27 million square kilometers of land were swallowed up by rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. When we know that the Sahara Desert was green during the Ice Age and is arid and barren today, and when an area larger than the entire subcontinent of India, the Amazon jungle, has hardly been subjected to any archaeological study at all. I'm not saying none, but very little. And it's understandable. It's a very challenging, very difficult environment to work in. Well, here's a sensational headline, as we would expect from the Daily Mail. Were Aborigines the first Americans? Native tribes in the Amazon found to be most closely related to indigenous Australians. This is one of those cases where the science is even more sensational than the headlines. And the science was published in Nature, in the scientific magazine Nature, a highly respected source, and it presents genetic evidence for 2 founding populations of the Americas. It was long held that there was only one founding population, and that their route was up through Siberia, across the Bering Straits, which were a land bridge during the Ice Age when sea levels were lower, into North America, down through North America, Central America, and finally into South America. But genetics has thrown a curveball into this analysis, because it turns out that a group of people in the Amazon jungle, number of tribes in the Amazon jungle, are closely related at the genetic level to Melanesians and Australian Aborigines, let's call them Australasians. And that would be fine if we found traces of that DNA in North America and Central America, but we don't. We only find it in the Amazon jungle, and that challenges the notion that the only route of migration was through the Americas in this way, because if that were the case, we would expect to find traces of that DNA throughout the Americas, not limited to the Amazon jungle. And furthermore, we know from a 2018 paper in the journal Cell, we know from that paper that this DNA signal in the Amazon is very old. It's not recent. It's very rare to find skeletal remains that go back more than 10,000 years, let alone 12 or 13,000 years. But a skeleton has been found in the Lagoa Santa area of Brazil, in the Amazon. It is dated to 10,400 years ago. And it contains that same Australasian DNA signal that is found surviving amongst peoples in the Amazon today. So that tells us that that signal reached the Amazon at least 10,400 years ago. And given that so much of the Amazon has not been excavated and that these remains often don't survive at all, it's safe to assume that it got there quite a bit before that. The experts themselves say that the anomalous genetic signal must have reached South America in the late Pleistocene, and that's just a fancy word for the Ice Age, so that it reached South America near the end of the last Ice Age. So that's the mystery. The Bering Straits do not seem to be involved in getting this DNA to the Amazon jungle. Now, one might reasonably ask, did the DNA start here and move there? but the answer to that is probably not, because that DNA signal is very powerfully represented here and less strongly represented here. So it looks like it originated there, and it looks like somebody crossed the Pacific Ocean during the last ice age. I got in touch with Professor S.G. Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen, one of the world's leading geneticists who's been behind quite a number of these studies, the lead author on a number of these studies, and I asked him about this. And he admitted, you know, nobody has a good explanation for the Australo-Melanesian signal. Everything that's put forward is speculative, and he suggested a number of possibilities, but amongst them he listed the following. Someone holding this signal comes into the Americas not through Beringia, but crossing into South America across the ocean, based purely on the genetic data. This is the most parsimonious explanation, but it does not make practical sense. 2 points there. When a scientist says the word parsimony, he's saying he likes that idea. The more elaborate and complicated your theory, the less likely it is to be true. The simpler and more direct the theory, the more likely it is to be true. That's the principle of parsimony in science. But then the second part of his statement, but it does not make practical sense. I asked him why, and he said, well, look, we have to rely on the work of other experts, and the archaeologists who are the expert in ancient cultures tell me that nobody was capable of crossing the Pacific Ocean during the Ice Age. It was just impossible. Yes, they did cross the Pacific Ocean during the Polynesian expansion, getting even to Easter Island, but that was 3,500 years ago, not 10, 12, 13,000 years ago at the end of the Ice Age. I don't blame Professor Willerslev for relying on archaeologists. It's normal in science to rely on the good quality of work done by other scientists, but I would raise a huge question mark over whether archaeology is a science at all. And in fact, there's quite a bit of contradictory evidence which suggests that somebody was traveling the world oceans during the Ice Age. And indeed mapping the world. And I went into this in my 1995 book, Fingerprints of the Gods. There are a number of maps that have survived. What these maps all have in common is they were drawn roughly between the 1400s and the 1700s. They do incorporate the latest navigational knowledge of that time, but where that wasn't available, they relied on earlier source maps. And those earlier source maps, often in a very bad condition, have not survived. And this is one of those maps, the Waldseemüller world map, and we can see a greatly extended Southeast Asia leading down to Australia here. Not at all as it looks today, but very much as it looked when sea levels were 400 feet lower at the last glacial maximum 21,300 years ago. Here's the islands of Japan, and the principal islands of Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku are 3 islands today. But during the Ice Age, they were all joined together. Kyushu and Shikoku were joined to Honshu. And oddly enough, the earliest map of Japan that survived into Western tradition, the 1424 Pisagano chart, shows Shikoku and Kyushu as part of the island of Honshu, as they were indeed during the Ice Age. This is the Pinkerton world map from 1818. It's a good map based on the latest scientific knowledge of the time, but as you will observe, something is missing from the picture, and that is Antarctica. And the reason Antarctica is missing from the picture is that our civilization didn't discover Antarctica until 1819, and that's why it's not on a map of 1818. But if you go back to those earlier maps, based on even older source maps, you'll find Antarctica in the right place all over those maps. Maps even drawn by Mercator, based on earlier source maps. And they show Antarctica a bit bigger than it is today, but much as it looked during the Ice Age. I could show you dozens of similar images from those maps.
Wow.
Here is the Canepa map of 1489, again based on ancient source maps now lost. And what we see is the Sahara Desert filled with an enormous river channel and with lakes highlighted in the color green. Oddly enough, a 2015 radar survey of Mauritania shows that such a river channel did once exist in the Sahara Desert, pretty much in exactly the place that is indicated on that 1489 map. It was there during the Ice Age, but it dried up subsequently, and the area, of course, is completely desert today. is a 1513 map of the British Isles, and lying just to the west of Ireland is a little island, which is labeled High Brazil. High Brazil is still there, but you have to go diving in order to see it today. This bathymetric map shows that an island of exactly the right size and shape lay exactly where it's indicated on this 1489 map, and it stayed there until roughly 13,000 years ago, when rising sea levels covered it. So it's an anomaly that it appears on this map. Either it's an extraordinary coincidence, or somebody was mapping the world during the last ice age. The Piri-Reis map is perhaps the most famous of these maps. It was once a world map, but all that survived of it is a corner which shows the west coast of Africa, the east coast of South America, going down towards Antarctica here, and the east coast of North America. Piri-Reis was a Turkish admiral. He tells us in his own handwriting on the map that he based it on more than 100 older source maps. And what's interesting about it, I won't get into the controversy about Antarctica in this case. What's interesting to me about it is this island, shown off the east coast of North America, roughly off Florida. And I've blown it up here, and on this island we can see what looks like a road or a row of megaliths running up the middle of the island, and that island is positioned exactly where Bimini is positioned today. And I have dived on that spot, and what you see underwater is the Bimini Road, a gigantic road of megaliths. And I actually don't care whether the road is natural or man-made. What intrigues me is that it's documented on this map. This map is documenting a feature that was last above water during the last ice age. So, to go back to the Amazon, it does at first seem like an unlikely setting to find science, but there is science in the Amazon. There are, for example, more than 150,000 different species of plants and trees in the Amazon. What an incredible source of biodiversity this place still is to this day. But if you want to make the visionary brew ayahuasca, you need to put two of those plants and trees together. You need to take the leaves of this bush, which is called chacruna in the Amazon, and the leaves contain substantial concentrations of, I'll have to use that word, the most powerful hallucinogen known to man, and that is dimethyltryptamine, DMT for short. However, DMT is not an orally active substance. And the reason that it's not orally active is because there's an enzyme in our gut called monoamine oxidase that switches off DMT on contact. So you could drink a tea made of hundreds of these leaves, and all you'd get is a bellyache. You wouldn't get a visionary experience at all. But if you cook those leaves together with the ayahuasca vine, you get a truly powerful visionary brew, which will take you on a journey that will last between 4 and 6 hours. In the West, people consume DMT largely by smoking it. It bypasses the gut and enters directly into the brain, and it produces, it's like a rocket ship to the other side of reality. The journey lasts about 10 minutes, and you really don't know what's happened to you when you come back. It's very difficult to integrate the experience, but with ayahuasca you have an experience that lasts from 4 to 6 hours and allows you to process the visions. So the mystery is that this vine contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. It switches off that enzyme in the gut, and I would say we're looking at science there. Trial and error just doesn't do it. You can't go through 150,000 different species of plants and trees to find these two, which are useless on their own, but put together produce profound visionary experiences. And the same is also true of the neuromuscular poison curare, which actually is the basis of modern Western anesthesiology. These days we use a synthetic form, but it was the real breakthrough in anesthesiology came from curare, and we learned that from the Amazonian peoples. Curare contains 11 different substances, none of which are active on their own. They all have to be brought together, and in the cooking of them, the fumes can be lethal. So it's a very complicated process, and one wonders how and why it was done. Well, I'm showing these Nazca line pictures here. You can see the Nazca spider, and it's identified as a species of Amazonian spider called Mimicium, an ant spider. And down here, probably not so clear in this light, is the monkey of Nazca with its prehensile tail. It's a characteristic of New World monkeys. Old World monkeys don't share it. New World monkeys have prehensile tails. And it's just a fact that in the Amazon, monkeys are an important source of protein in the diet of Amazonian peoples. And they hunt monkeys by shooting them with bows and arrows. Here's the problem. Your monkey is 200 feet up a tree. If you shoot it with an arrow that is not tipped with curare, you may kill it. But what it's going to do as it falls is it's going to wrap that prehensile tail around a tree branch and lock onto it tight. And suddenly, dinner is 200 feet above you, hanging from the top of a tree. You want dinner on the ground. That's why they created curare, because curare paralyzes the muscles, and the monkey cannot wrap its tail around the trees, and it drops straight to the ground, and dinner is served. As well as these Amazonian creatures on the Nazca Plateau, there's also a great deal of geometry, and we will come back to that. Francisco de Orellana was the first European to cross the entire length of the Amazon jungle, and he did so between 1541 and 1542. It was not his intention. He set out with a group of about 20 or 30 men in a boat. They had established a base camp. They were looking for El Dorado, as a matter of fact. They left most of the expedition in the base camp, and they set off to hunt and to bring back food to the expedition. But the Amazon disagreed, and it carried that boat more than 4,000 kilometers all the way through the Amazon and all the way until they finally ended up in the Atlantic Ocean, and thence made their way back through Mexico. On that journey, Orellana and his men reported seeing enormous cities, and they reported seeing huge populations and evidence of advanced arts and crafts. 100 years later, when other Europeans started to make their way into the Amazon, they couldn't find any trace of those cities. And they came to the conclusion that Orellana and his team had made the whole story up. It was a kind of fantasy. But it wasn't a fantasy. They were absolutely right. The reason those cities had gone is that the Spanish introduced smallpox into the Amazon. And that smallpox, the local people had no immunity to it. There was a massive die-off of the populations. The cities were deserted. They were overgrown by the jungle, and 100 years later, nobody could see them anymore. We can see them today because of the tragic clearances of the Amazon. These lost garden cities are beginning to emerge from the Amazon, and the evidence now, and I go into it in detail in the book, is that these cities had populations that were substantially larger in many cases than the greatest cities of Europe. At that time. Very big cities, an estimated total population in the Amazon of 20 million people before the Spanish conquest. How could that possibly be so? Rainforest soils are not very fertile. They are fertile on the surface, but it's all caused by the leaves falling to the ground in a kind of mulch. Under the surface, they're not fertile. The Amazonians were able to support themselves, support large populations, because they actually invented a soil. And that soil, we can trace its origins back at least to 8,000 years ago. I'm convinced it goes back much further if only more archaeology were done. But there are 8,000-year-old patches of terra preta, and you can still take a handful of that terra preta and you can add it to completely barren soil, and it will turn that soil fertile and make it productive again very quickly. And it does so because it's full of microorganisms that are not found in other